Pixar has always been one of the greatest aspects of my childhood. From the stories of Toy Story to The Incredibles, there was always something to look forward to when Disney would always slip up a bit in their animation department. The stories themselves tended to feel more real, either using animals or inanimate objects express themselves in ways that could feel human, or using actual humans to tell that very powerful stories, to blend two worlds that we already know exist in our life and make them both encapsulate the human experience. But in recent times, they've actually proven that they aren't the studio that they once were. Not in terms of like they are creating awful content right now, but in actual terms of they are creating mediocre content expressed within the likes of Lightyear and the multiple sequels that have been released. And this is a fact that has started to worry me and other people within the likes of Elemental's trailer's release. A movie that is seemingly making everyone conflicted with its style and seemingly basic plot. It's not that I hate what I see, because I love this new style that they are going for with the elements themselves, but the story remains to be everything. Whether what we hear will continue to be the generic plotline we've already seen before, or actually doing something different. Because not to be rude, but this film is directed by the same guys who brought us The Good Dinosaur. A not bad film by normal standards, but by Pixar standards, it truly felt like it was awful for its lack of substance, its minimalistic story, and its underdeveloped characters. And if the overall theme that we have been presented here so far sticks to that typical love story and seeking beyond what your parents want out of your life in this film, then sadly it's going to end up failing yet again, and that is something I really don't want. But then again, I have been disappointed time after time with the company I used to love growing up. Because more and more as time goes on, Pixar has been more focusing on developing its animation more than anything other than its story. Every sequel we see and every new production that has come out reflects on the impressive growth of their CGI becoming more real than you could ever thought possible, beginning back in Toy Story and comparing that with Toy Story 4. All of which does not excuse the type of stories that have been produced so far. And like I said before, this has been an overall Disney problem by itself and not pertaining to one simple studio, whether it be from Pixar, Disney Animation, to Star Wars to Marvel, and the rest of live action. It's just that here we see this whole entire company have a clear lack of ambition or creativity to do something more, and Pixar has truly experienced some of that. Not to the extent of what the others have been doing, because they still know what they want for the most part, but overall feeling overruled by a company's tight fist to play it safe in every single market they come across. A problem that actually started way back in Cars 2. Because up until the point before Cars 2, Pixar was definitely on a roll in its golden age, either making the greatest sequels ever to their most famous property, or individual stories that captured its audiences around the world. Each of them had their own distinct elements that connected us with the natural world, or unnatural in terms of monsters or whatnot, dealing with dreams or careers and other aspirations out of what we want in our own life. The focus of wanting more, of getting you out of that hole that you're currently in, and developing and growing along that entire journey. I have said before that each film managed to connect with each other yet feel completely different in terms of their story. When one film came out after the next, you just get this overall picture that they were presenting us to connect to both adult and kid worlds together, enough to have that picture more noticeable as you grew up and understand more about the world. That they weren't afraid to lean in more within the adult themes in a kid's world that emotionally pulled any viewer that was sucked into watching them, that concluded well within Toy Story 3. And the success of Toy Story 3 proved that more of these stories could be told because they kept the main themes and kept expanding upon them, both presented in their villains and in their new stories to encourage more sequels to be made about them, which brings us all back to Cars 2 once again, but this time failing in the worst way imaginable. Looking back on it, we do notice more and more how this became a turning point for Pixar taking a tumble. How instead of progressing the message that the original had, they took the wrong detour, making a story that isn't related to at all what they began with. The whole entire plot revolves around Mater becoming a spy while Lightning goes on a tour, where I still can't understand what the main theme about this was really trying to present, other than an idiot friend who turns out to be the savior of Cars kind or whatever. It really doesn't teach or perfect what Cars was originally all about, sidelining the main character of the story for a supporting character friend to take hold in this world that moves away from the main focus of cars and racing, and only afterwards would they actually return to that idea in Cars 3, a little too late in my opinion to be focusing on that type of story when they ruined that opportunity to connect like Toy Story did to progress that. It's these little bits and pieces that are important to the story that makes them or breaks them, where in this case number 2 literally broke everything, and is why Cars 3 was less financially successful than Cars 2, because people have already gotten this expectation that the series was not going to deliver anything coherent with these group of cars. That's not to say it was a bomb, because it was still a success, but overall it was still smaller than the other films, signifying how people started to notice the faults in their stars. And this once again brings up a detail I already covered in their sequels and why they never worked, because they don't do much in the way of their predecessors. And it is because of Cars 2 setting the standard for this, influencing how they all played it out, playing it more safe by giving supporting characters more of screen time and making some of their villains have lackluster qualities. Like for the most part in sequels like Finding Dory, it is literally about her finding her past and herself, and how she gets caught away from both Nemo and Marlin, just like how Nemo was in the first, and similar in the case of Incredibles 2, that Elastigirl was doing this superhero stuff to reignite the passions in the public and make them legal, just as what Bob was doing in the original to relive the glory days and help people out. Nothing more or nothing less than what already was. Where of course during this time, it was the case of Monster University that made an interesting prequel about how they came to be, having these strong themes of finding your place in the world, but it still didn't really connect considering the themes presented in the original Monsters Inc. film and the backstory we have already discovered with Mike and Sully. And then once again, in the realms of sequels, the real turning point that marked Pixar's inability to create any more compelling sequels was once again present in Toy Story 4, ruining anything that was built in the previous three by having plot points that didn't actually make sense in the cases of Woody or Bonnie, or learning and growing from what Andy taught us, how nothing really added to its story despite being a masterpiece in its own right, doing more bad than good overall for its name in the public, where no matter how good or bad the story could be, what really matters is what type of story is being presented from beginning to the very end. Sequels for the most part just capitalize on our favorite nostalgic moments in the past and don't do anything more with that story, once again upgraded visually but lacking otherwise in other cases that started to seep into other stories, once again bringing up the good dinosaur and how it will affect what Elemental is trying to present. Because the reason why we all hated the good dinosaur is because it refused to go beyond what Pixar would usually do, the minimalist story that has already been told that doesn't want to develop beyond that, presenting themes mainly geared towards kids rather than both kids and adults. And it wasn't helped that this was released during the same year as Inside Out, which to be frank is another problem that Disney has, a problem that actually started way back when Treasure Planet was released at the same time as Lilo and Stitch, and when Cars 3 was released the same year as Coco. Good films released during mediocre ones that failed to stick the landing, which brings into question how long they are actually able to develop some of these stories in favor of the big ones, how the latter ones, except for Cars 3 in this case as it came out first, tended to sink while their previous ones were actually the most successful films of the entire year. The Good Dinosaur, compared to the likes of Inside Out, has a story that is more toned down and more just made simple for a younger audience, when the other ones still wanted to tell something real and emotional in the literal sense that all of us as humans go through, where of course this other film is not being remotely bad but distinctly lacking the style that it needed to be regarded as a classic Pixar film. This kind of thing happened once again within the likes of Onward and Soul being released in the same year, having one that has this unique style compared to Pixar's past, but not one that really stands out like it used to when released, with the likes of Soul being the more realistic and having the most heart. Not to say I didn't enjoy them like the others, and they did come out during COVID that hampered their box office success, but looking back on things like Onward, it actually lacks something a bit more, some sort of feeling that I had when I was younger, where I can't really describe that feeling other than a lack of going beyond the pale, if you know what I mean. That tested, tried and true formula that most people do rather than separating yourself into something more. It's a feeling of confusion I still can't understand, where you're still missing a piece of yourself. All of these stories right now mainly remove their fact that they have villains, except in the case of Luca and how they're just starting to test the waters of different animated styles. It's like I just feel like the distinct lack of the goal being presented when one of the objects that they usually have to block that story from going through isn't there anymore. The problem with why Turning Red was not for me simply because it wasn't a story that related to me, which isn't a bad thing. I can feel that this connects with a certain audience with features that were present in that very situation, but still doesn't feel as broad enough to connect with everyone despite a new style, how they aren't doing too much creative wise but doing enough to suffice as a good story. And I'm pretty sure that's an issue other people have with the film, but by no means should this be considered as bad as any other story because it is unique in its own right. It's more that you know what you're getting into rather than expecting something unexpected to happen, how before you didn't realize at first what Wall-E was trying to do, where you just first see a robot go about its daily routine as the last life form on the planet Earth, until we realized over time what the true message was about this film, humans losing their way, once again finding this through the means of a robot that is literally made up of bits and pieces and isn't alive like we are, who knew the value of what living was really like. Where nowadays you see with newer stories, Lightyear have no real grand story to offer us other than the fact it was based off of Toy Story, adding nothing more once again to anything it really tried to present, adapting or original story-wise. In Lightyear, its plot doesn't remotely involve anything we knew of Buzz and made his villain into himself to try to gain sympathy for a figure who is meant to be a tyrant rather than an old fool who's trying to fix a mistake to prove some point to complete his mission. It's mainly a story that wanted to do nothing with Toy Story to try to be something else, but ultimately failed because it needed that connection in order to sell it to the public. How spin-offs work even less because despite being based off in that world, it does really nothing meaningful compared to the series of Buzz Lightyear of Star Command that actually showed the real context for Buzz's very character, or even the video game sequence in the beginning of Toy Story 2. And this all brings us right back to now to fully issue my concerns with Elemental. Now, when I saw the trailer of Elemental, I was met with some concerned optimism. I liked the style that they were presenting to do something distinctly different than other Pixar films, having this art style that portrays elements in a human way while not actually involving any humans present like they did in the past, or having that realistic shine to it. Going for this more cartoonish feel of Luca and Turning Red to be more expressive that would actually truly make it its own unique film. Well, of course still bringing up the issue that will be its very plot. Because the listed premise states that in a city where fire, water, land, and air residents live together, a fiery young woman and a go-with-the-flow guy are about to discover something elemental, how much they actually have in common. Basically, to sum all of that up, it feels like the typical love story of two people from distinctively different cultures coming together beyond their sheltered parents. Something as basic as you can get that doesn't really go beyond the pale of that very trope. It just somehow feels like a deja vu situation where I've already seen this story before and I don't know if it's going to change anything when I already know how it's going to end. Feelings that were clearly different in the early stages where, like in stories like Toy Story 3, you didn't know if this was the true ending of the toys in a landfill or something else. But don't get me wrong, I like this interesting approach to portray different people and different cultures coming together displayed as the elements of fire and water, but it still leaves much to be desired. Just feeling more formulaic than usual with the similar type of world that Zootopia showed us, where it's very beautiful but the story feels like the same as the rest, just slapped with a new coat of paint on it, which to be honest is very tiring. I'm just honestly tired of seeing them show us the same generational family films that are bad for the young ones who want something new, and I just want a newer path for these characters to take that the story could actually present us, not telling Romeo and Juliet for the 1000th time in a row. The problem that most people already had to begin with was how they were already able to deduce this in the very first teaser, where this trailer showed us no different and confirms for the most part about what is already happening in the story. Doing no different but still leaves people enough to go see it to remain cautious as it is with other films to come out during this time. And I just really feel sad because I really care about unique storytelling with unique animation to tell that, and how Pixar just feels like it's slowly losing that grip over time, still creating sequels that began with the announcement of Inside Out 2 and continuing within Toy Story 5, a sequel that nobody wants, leaving more to be concerned about what the future will come of these, where the latter previously already added nothing more to that story and will only result in it further sinking beyond belief, while still bringing up many to be concerned about coming from Inside Out and what it can do with that very story. All of this puts into question the level of creativity that the studio is even allowed at doing anymore, with what Lightyear already taught us and what is being allowed seeping in all levels of Disney to do more of the same rather than for pushing something completely new. You can do one thing different than what you've already originally planned, but the rest has to follow for that to work overall, and if you can't do that, then the stories will not work in service to the greater public. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.